Did you know that German soldiers in Normandy initially laughed when they heard the distinctive ping of an M1 Garand ejecting its empty clip? That's their signal of weakness, veteran sergeants told new recruits, explaining that the metallic sound meant an American soldier was vulnerable, reloading, defenseless for a few crucial seconds. German soldiers were trained to listen for that ping, to rush forward in that moment, to exploit the American rifle's obvious flaw. Smart German soldiers stopped following this advice after about a week. The ones who kept trying it didn't live long enough to learn why. This is the story of how the M1 Garand, mocked by German soldiers as a noisy, complicated, inferior rifle, became the weapon they feared most, not despite its flaws, but because everything they'd been taught about infantry combat was suddenly, catastrophically wrong. The ping wasn't a weakness, it was a countdown timer to their deaths. The story begins in June 1944, along the hedgerows of Normandy, where German defensive positions faced the Allied invasion. Wehrmacht veterans from the Eastern Front had been transferred west to meet the expected invasion, bringing with them years of combat experience and absolute confidence in their infantry weapons. Obergefreiter Hans Krüger was one of these veterans. He'd fought at Stalingrad, survived the retreat from Ukraine, and earned the Iron Cross for actions against Soviet forces. He carried a Karabiner 98K, the Kar-98K, a bolt-action rifle that had served Germany since 1935 and was itself an evolution of designs dating to 1898. It was a weapon Hans knew intimately: 5-round internal magazine, bolt-action operation, effective range of 500 meters, absolutely reliable under any conditions. Hans and his fellow veterans had faced Soviet infantry equipped with various rifles, mostly Mosin Nagants, bolt-action rifles similar to the Kar-98K, along with some SVT-40 semi-automatics that Soviet soldiers themselves didn't particularly trust. The Germans had established infantry tactics that worked: accurate aimed fire from bolt-action rifles, supported by MG-42 machine guns that provided devastating suppressive fire. A well-trained German soldier could fire 10 to 15 aimed shots per minute with his Kar-98K. That had been enough on the Eastern Front. It should be enough here. Then Hans heard his first firefight with American forces, and something sounded wrong. The rhythm of the gunfire was off. Bolt-action rifles have a distinctive cadence, crack, pause, as soldiers work the bolt between shots. Machine guns have a continuous roar. What Hans heard was something in between: semi-continuous cracking, faster than bolt-action fire but more controlled than machine guns. Individual shots, but coming so rapidly they almost blurred together. "They're wasting ammunition," his sergeant, Feldwebel Otto Schmidt, declared. "Typical Americans, spray bullets everywhere, no fire discipline, no precision. We'll kill them with aimed shots while they empty their magazines into trees." This assessment made sense within German military doctrine. German infantry training emphasized marksmanship. Every soldier was trained to make every shot count. Fire discipline was sacred. You aimed carefully, squeezed the trigger smoothly, worked the bolt and fired again. Rapid fire was for machine guns. Riflemen were precision instruments. The Americans, by all reports reaching German command, had a new rifle called the M1 Garand, a semi-automatic weapon that fired every time you pulled the trigger, without needing to work a bolt. German intelligence had examined captured examples and identified numerous flaws. It was heavy, 9.5 pounds compared to 8.6 for the Kar-98K. It was complicated, a gas-operated action with multiple moving parts versus a simple bolt. It held only 8 rounds compared to the Kar-98K's 5, but couldn't be topped off. You had to fire all 8 rounds before you could reload. And most damningly, it made that loud ping sound when the empty 8-round clip ejected, announcing to everyone that the shooter was empty and reloading. German soldiers were taught to exploit this weakness, listen for the ping, rush forward, kill the American while he's fumbling with a new clip. It seemed like sound tactical doctrine, based on real weakness in the American weapon design. Hans's first encounter with American infantry came 3 days after D-Day. His unit was defending a hedgerow position when American forces probed their lines. Hans took position behind the thick Norman hedge, his Kar-98K ready, and waited for targets. An American squad appeared about 100 meters away, moving through an adjacent field. Hans aimed carefully at the lead soldier, just as he'd been trained. Before he could fire, the hedge in front of him exploded with incoming fire. Not machine gun fire. He knew what that sounded like. This was rifle fire, but impossibly fast and sustained. Bark and leaves and dirt erupted around his position as multiple American soldiers opened fire simultaneously. Hans ducked, waited for the fire to slacken, then popped up to return fire. He aimed, fired, worked the bolt, aimed, and had to duck again as another volley of American fire shredded his position. He'd gotten one shot off. The Americans had fired what sounded like 20 or 30 rounds in the same time. "They're panicking," Feldwebel-Schmidt shouted, "wasting ammunition. Hold your positions and return aimed fire." But Hans was beginning to suspect something else was happening. He'd faced panicked enemy soldiers before, Soviets who'd fired wildly, spraying bullets without aiming, burning through ammunition in pure fear. This wasn't that. The American fire was accurate, sustained, yes, rapid, yes, but accurate. The shots were hitting the hedge exactly where German soldiers were positioned. This wasn't panic fire, this was controlled, aimed, rapid fire. Hans risked another shot. As he raised his rifle, he heard that distinctive sound. Ping from the American position. One of them had just emptied his Garand. This was the moment German tactics said to exploit. Hans and 2 other German soldiers in his section rose up to fire at the exposed Americans. What happened next happened very fast. The American who'd made the ping sound was indeed reloading. Hans saw him clearly, inserting a new 8-round clip. But the 7 other Americans in the squad were not reloading. They were shooting, all of them, simultaneously. The German soldier to Hans's right, a man named Peter who'd been at Hans's side since Stalingrad, took 3 rounds in the chest before he could even aim. He dropped without a sound. The soldier to Hans's left managed to fire once before an American bullet caught him in the throat. Hans himself fired, missed, worked his bolt, and dove for cover as a storm of bullets bracketed his position. He'd been taught that when an American Garand pinged, that American was vulnerable. What he'd just learned was that when one American's Garand pinged, 7 other Americans' Garands were still loaded and shooting. The ping wasn't a weakness in the system, it was a trap. Germans who'd learned to listen for it were being conditioned to attack at exactly the moment when they'd be most exposed to fire from the other squad members. Worse, in the time it took Hans to fire 1 shot, work his bolt and fire again, each American with a Garand could fire 8 shots without breaking rhythm. The Americans weren't just shooting faster, they were shooting 8 times faster while maintaining accuracy. The firefight continued for 10 minutes before Hans's section was forced to retreat, leaving behind 4 dead and 2 wounded. They'd faced a single American squad, about 12 men, and been forced back by superior firepower alone. No American artillery, no air support, just rifle fire. But rifle fire at a volume and intensity that Hans had never experienced. That evening, as his depleted unit reorganized, Hans listened to similar stories from other sections. Everyone had encountered the same overwhelming American firepower. Everyone had noticed the same thing. The Americans never seemed to stop shooting. They fired continuously, methodically, with a rhythm that was impossible for bolt-action rifles to match. Feldwebel-Schmidt tried to maintain morale. The Americans are compensating for poor marksmanship with the volume of fire. German soldiers are trained marksmen. Our single well-aimed shots are worth 10 of their sprayed bullets. But the casualty figures told a different story. Hans's company had started the day with 120 men. After scattered engagements with American infantry, no major battles, just firefights in hedgerows, they'd lost 35 men killed or wounded. The Americans, by observation, had suffered maybe a dozen casualties. The math was undeniable and terrifying. Over the following days, German soldiers developed a new respect and fear for the Garand's distinctive sound. The ping went from being a signal of opportunity to being an omen of death. Because German soldiers learned that Americans using Garands employed a brutal tactic, they staggered their reloads. In an 8-man American rifle squad, the soldiers would reload 1 or 2 at a time, never all at once. While 2 men reloaded, 6 kept shooting. By the time those 2 finished reloading, 2 others would reload. The result was continuous fire. There was never a moment when all the Garands were empty, never a moment when Germans could safely advance. And the reloading itself was frighteningly fast. The Garand's 8-round end-block clip could be inserted in about 2 seconds by a trained soldier. Germans working the bolt on their Kar 98K needed about the same time to chamber each individual round. So while a German soldier was loading his 5th round, an American soldier had already loaded 8 rounds and was shooting again. Hans witnessed the mathematical reality of this during a German counterattack against American positions near St. Lo. His company, reinforced to nearly full strength, attacked an American company defending a tree line. German doctrine called for advancing under covering fire from MG-42 machine guns, with riflemen moving in short rushes, using terrain for cover. The attack began well. The MG-42s opened up with their distinctive buzzsaw sound, firing at 1,200 rounds per minute, far faster than any Allied machine gun. Under this covering fire, German infantry advanced by squads, rushing from hedgerow to hedgerow. Then they entered effective range of American Garands, about 300 meters, and the attack stalled instantly. The volume of American rifle fire was so intense that it rivaled the German machine gun fire. Every American soldier was pumping out rounds continuously, and there were hundreds of them. The air filled with bullets. German soldiers trying to advance were cut down in their rushing movements. Those who went to ground found themselves pinned by sustained fire that never slackened. Hans, pinned behind a low stone wall, tried to return fire. He rose up, aimed at an American position, fired, worked his bolt, rose again, aimed, fired, worked his bolt. Each time he exposed himself to shoot, he drew fire from multiple American positions. Each time he ducked to work his bolt, the Americans kept shooting at where they'd seen him, chipping away at his stone cover. He managed 6 shots in 2 minutes before his stone wall had been reduced to rubble by American fire, and he was forced to crawl backwards to better cover. In those same 2 minutes, the Americans facing his section had probably fired 200 rounds, maybe more. The counterattack collapsed after 30 minutes. German casualties, over 60 men killed or wounded. American casualties, estimated at 15 to 20. The Germans had attacked with local numerical superiority, with machine gun support, with veteran soldiers who understood infantry tactics. They'd been stopped cold by American rifle fire alone. That night, back in their defensive positions, Feldwebel Schmidt finally admitted what everyone had been thinking. Their rifle is better than ours. Not more accurate, maybe. Not more reliable, maybe, but faster. And in infantry combat, faster shooting wins. It was a bitter admission from men who'd been trained to believe German weapons were superior, German tactics were superior, German soldiers were superior. The Kar-98K was an excellent rifle by any objective measure. Accurate, reliable, proven in 2 world wars. But it was a bolt-action rifle in a world that had moved to semi-automatics, and no amount of training or skill could overcome that fundamental disadvantage. Hans began noticing other aspects of American firepower superiority. The Americans didn't just have Garands. They had Browning automatic rifles, BARs, integrated into every squad. These were fully automatic rifles firing the same .30-06 ammunition as the Garand, providing squad-level machine gun capability. German squads had to rely on MG-42s for automatic fire, and those were company-level weapons that couldn't be everywhere at once. American squads also carried more ammunition per man. Each American rifleman carried 80 rounds immediately accessible in clips and bandoliers, with more in their packs. German soldiers typically carried 60 rounds for their Kar-98K. The Americans could sustain higher rates of fire for longer periods, and Americans used their ammunition differently. German doctrine emphasized conservation. Make every shot count, fire only when you have a clear target, preserve ammunition for when it's truly needed. American doctrine emphasized fire superiority. Put more rounds downrange than the enemy can, suppress enemy positions constantly, use firepower to enable maneuver. The German approach worked when everyone had similar weapons. When Germans with Kar-98s faced Soviets with Mosin Nagants, both firing at similar rates, fire discipline and marksmanship made the difference. When Germans with Kar-98s faced Americans with Garands, the Americans could afford to fire 8 rounds for every German round, and still maintain fire superiority because their rifles let them. Hans saw this principle in action during a German defensive stand near Carentan. His reduced company, down to maybe 80 men, held prepared positions against an American attack. They had good fields of fire, adequate ammunition, and MG-42 support. By traditional defensive doctrine, they should have been able to hold against forces 3 or 4 times their size. The Americans attacked with about 2 companies, maybe 300 men. As they advanced across open ground, German MG-42s opened fire, cutting down the lead American elements. The attack should have faltered right there. On the Eastern Front, Soviet attacks had broken under similar machine gun fire. The Americans went to ground and started shooting back, and that's when Hans realized they were in trouble. 300 Americans with Garands, all firing semi-automatically, produced more sustained fire than 80 Germans with Kar-98Ks, even supported by MG-42s. The American fire was so intense that German soldiers couldn't effectively man their positions. Every time someone raised up to shoot, bullets cracked past their heads. The Germans were being outshot in prepared defensive positions, which shouldn't have been possible. The American fire didn't slacken for 20 minutes. Continuous, sustained, methodical fire that chipped away at German positions. Hans tried to fire back, but every time he exposed himself, multiple Americans shot at him immediately. He got off maybe 10 shots in 20 minutes. The Americans facing him had probably fired 200 rounds each. Eventually, under cover of this massive rifle fire, American soldiers with BARs and Bangalore torpedoes crawled forward to blast gaps in German wire obstacles. More infantry poured through. The German position was overrun not by tactical brilliance, but by simple firepower mathematics. Hans survived by retreating early, along with maybe 30 other Germans. The rest of the company was killed, wounded, or captured. They'd been dug in, well positioned, ready to defend, and they'd lost because they couldn't match American firepower. By July 1944, German soldiers had stopped mocking the M1 Garand. They'd stopped listening for the ping as a signal to attack. They'd learned, through painful experience, that the Garand's advantages vastly outweighed its supposed weaknesses. Yes, it made noise when empty, but it was empty for 2 seconds compared to the Kar-98K's constant cycling. Yes, it couldn't be topped off, but it held 8 rounds that could be fired rapidly, versus 5 rounds that required bolt cycling between each shot. German after-action reports from Normandy consistently noted American firepower superiority at the infantry level. One report from Panzerlehr Division stated, "American infantry squads possess firepower equivalent to our infantry platoons. Their semi-automatic rifles allow sustained fire rates that our bolt-action rifles cannot match. In firefights, American units can maintain fire superiority even when outnumbered 2-1 or 3-1. Recommend urgent development of semi-automatic rifles for Wehrmacht or tactical doctrine changes to compensate for firepower disadvantage." The recommendation went nowhere. Germany lacked the industrial capacity and raw materials to produce semi-automatic rifles in the quantities needed. The Gewehr 43, Germany's semi-automatic rifle, was produced in limited numbers and was less reliable than the Kar-98K. Most German infantry would fight the entire war with bolt-action rifles that were fundamentally outclassed by American semi-automatics. Some German soldiers obtained captured Garands and used them despite regulations against using enemy weapons. The reasons were simple. The Garand let them shoot faster, carry more immediately available ammunition, and maintain fire superiority in engagements. German soldiers using Garand survived longer and fought more effectively than those using Kar-98 Kund. Obergefreiter Hans Krüger was one of those soldiers. After his company was shattered near Carentan, he found himself in a makeshift unit with whatever survivors could be scraped together. During patrol, they overran an American supply dump and Hans acquired an M1 Garand, 4 8-round clips, and a bandolier with another 40 rounds. He spent a day learning the weapon, how to load it, how to operate the safety, how to adjust the sights. The Garand was heavier than his Kar-98K, but balanced differently. The gas-operated action had a different recoil impulse. The trigger was different. But once he understood it, Hans realized he was holding something revolutionary. The first time he used the Garand in combat, Hans felt like he'd been fighting with one arm tied behind his back his entire military career. He could fire 8 shots without breaking his aim, without working a bolt, just pulling the trigger and putting rounds down range. When the clip ejected with its distinctive ping, he slapped in a new one in 2 seconds and kept shooting. In a firefight with a small American patrol, Hans single-handedly produced as much fire as his 3 squadmates combined, all of whom had Kar-98s. They won the engagement quickly, and afterwards his squadmates looked at Hans's Garand with undisguised envy. "That's how they beat us," one said simply. "We're still fighting with rifles from the last war. They brought rifles from the next war." Hans used his captured Garand for the next 3 months, through the retreat from Normandy, the fighting in the Falaise pocket, and the desperate defensive actions in eastern France. He became efficient with it, learned to reload smoothly, maintained it carefully with American gun oil from captured supplies. When ammunition ran low, he scrounged .30-06 rounds from captured American supply caches or looted from dead American soldiers. In September 1944, Hans's luck ran out. During a rearguard action near the German border, he was wounded by American artillery and evacuated. In the field hospital, a German officer noticed his Garand and confiscated it, reprimanding him for using enemy equipment. Hans was issued a new Kar 98K from supplies. Holding the Kar 98K again after months with the Garand felt like stepping backwards in time. The bolt action that he'd once operated without thinking now felt painfully slow. 5 rounds instead of 8. Manual cycling between shots instead of semi-automatic fire. It was like trading a car for a horse-drawn wagon. Both would get you where you needed to go, but one was clearly from a previous era. Hans survived the war, surrendered to American forces in April 1945, and spent time in a POW camp. There, talking with other German soldiers, he found his experience was widely shared. Veteran soldiers who'd faced American infantry all told the same story. They'd mocked the Garand until they fought against it, then feared it, then desperately wanted one themselves. In one conversation, a former sergeant named Wilhelm shared his analysis. The Kar 98K is a better rifle than the Garand by traditional measures, more accurate at long range, more reliable in adverse conditions, simpler maintenance. If we were fighting World War I again, where aimed fire at 500 meters mattered most, the Kar 98K would be superior. But we weren't fighting World War I. We were fighting a war where fire volume at 300 meters mattered most, and in that war the Garand was superior. We brought precision tools to a volume competition. Another soldier, a former machine gunner, added, "The Americans understood something we didn't. In modern infantry combat, suppression matters more than precision. If you can put so many bullets in the air that the enemy can't effectively return fire, you win. The Garand let every American rifleman create suppressive fire. Our Kar 98K couldn't compete. We needed MG-42s to match what they did with rifles. In the post-war years, as militaries worldwide evaluated lessons from the war, the M1 Garand became the template for modern infantry rifles. Semi-automatic or automatic operation became standard. Every major military recognized that bolt-action rifles were obsolete. Even the Germans, when they rebuilt their military in the 1950s, adopted semi-automatic designs rather than returning to bolt-action weapons. The Garand's influence extended beyond just semi-automatic operation. Military theorists recognized that it represented a fundamental shift in infantry combat philosophy. The old model, careful aimed fire, fire discipline, ammunition conservation, gave way to a new model. Fire superiority through volume, suppression of enemy positions, overwhelming firepower at squad level. The German soldiers who mocked the M1 Garand learned too late that their mockery was born from misunderstanding. They'd focused on the Garand's weaknesses: the ping, the inability to top off, the weight, the complexity. Without understanding its overwhelming strength, it let American soldiers shoot 8 times before a German soldier could shoot twice. And in infantry combat, the side that shoots faster usually wins. Did you know that the M1 Garand served in the US military for nearly 40 years, from 1936 to 1957, and saw action in 3 major wars? That General George S. Patton called it the greatest battle implement ever devised. That captured German intelligence reports specifically warned their soldiers to expect overwhelming American rifle fire and to avoid prolonged firefights with American infantry. That today, military historians credit the Garand with giving American infantry a fundamental tactical advantage that significantly contributed to Allied victory in Europe. The German soldiers who thought the ping of an ejecting clip was a weakness died, learning it was a warning. The ones who survived learned to fear it, because that ping meant an American soldier had just fired 8 rounds in the time a German soldier fired 2, and in 2 seconds would be firing 8 more. The mockery turned to respect, the respect turned to fear, and the fear was entirely justified. Because in the end, the rifle that spoke faster won the conversation, and all the bolt-action precision in the world couldn't compete with semi-automatic speed. The Kar 98K was a fine rifle from an elegant era of warfare. The M1 Garand was a brutal tool from a new era of industrial slaughter, and brutal tools beat elegant weapons when the only question that matters is, who can put more lead downrange before the other side kills you?